Hello and welcome to the 7th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I'll talk about the 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they have to be a relic weapon. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official DireWolf event or that reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. The tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For a more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. Relic weapons have been an important part of the game since the beginning, and even though they took a dip in popularity in the last few years, there are still some older ones that stood the test of time, and some newer ones that had a big impact on the recent competitive seasons. In this video I will talk about those, and about the old guard of relic weapons that had a lot of success in the early years of competitive Eternal and less so in the later years. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards made the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments. And with that, let's begin. First up we have Jawbone Greatsword. It's a 4 power, double fire influence, rare 5/2 relic weapon with Overwhelm, and on tribute you create and draw Brand without fear. He is a 6 power, double fire influence, 8/6 unit with Berserk, and on summon you can sacrifice another unit to give him Overwhelm. Greatsword came out in set 4, the Fall of Archenport, towards the end of the 2018 ETS season, and immediately made a splash in a number of different aggro and midrange decks, but it did took until 2019 to become somewhat of a staple in a few decks. At the start of the season it was mostly played as a market card in Brex's tokens and occasionally in Skycrack Aggro and Skycrack Yetis. Then a few months later at 1 to 4 copies in the main deck of Praxis Pledge, another midrange deck, and towards the end of the season it was a staple in the markets of Stonescar Aggro. 5 attack meant that it could kill mid-sized units, but it could also be used to kill the opponent fast if they didn't have any units on board. Aggressive decks could also trigger the tribute effect quite easily by attacking because they were in the position to demand trades more often. It completely faded out of throne in the 2020 season though, and only made a lone top in Brex's Aggro in 2021. In the 2020 Expedition season it saw some play in Dragon decks as a one-off target for Dragonforge that you could search if you needed it, at 2 to 4 copies in Rakano Aggro or Rakano Armory, which had some weapon synergy with cards like Tinker Overseer and Strange Blacksmith, and in Skycrack midrange as a one-off that you could draw when you killed the opponent Siegebreaker, because Siegebreaker saw a lot of play back then. Next up we have Nullblade. It's a 4 power, triple shadow influence legendary 5/3 relic weapon, and on summon every unit and weapon in the enemy void gets -5/-5, and that same debuff is applied to all units and weapons that enter the enemy void while Nullblade is on the field. It was released in set 6, Dark Frontier, towards the end of the 2019 season, and had an immediate impact on the last few tournaments of that year. Felon Reanimator was still occasionally played at that point, and cards like Last Chance or Dark Return also saw play, so the void hate did matter sometimes, but even in matchups where it didn't matter, Nullblade was still similar to Jawbone Greatsword, a fairly big weapon for just 4 power, which made it a staple at 1 to 3 copies in the main deck of Stonescar Aggro. In 2020 it continued to see play in Stonescar Aggro markets, but more sparsely than before. Additionally it was played in Felon midrange and in a few other control and midrange decks, mostly as a market tech to counter decks like Felon and later Cena and Reanimator. It continued to show up here and there in the following 2 throne seasons, for example in Stonescar Seal markets and Archenport Minotaur main decks, but it wasn't a big factor anymore. The same can be said for Expedition, where it was sparsely played in different shadow midrange decks in 2020 and in Archenport Minotaurs in 2022. On rank 8 we have Sword of the Psy-King, our first set 1 card. It's an 8 power, double justice influence 8/8 legendary relic weapon without any other effects. Sword had a very strong showing in the 2 ETS seasons, 2017 and 18, where it was played at 1 or 2 copies in the sideboards of Compre midrange, and in the main deck of Rise to Challenge decks like FGS Armory, FGP Control and FTG Midrange, and then later towards the end of 2018 in TGP Control and FGS Midrange. It faded out of popularity in 2019 though, partly because the game just got faster, and partly because it struggled thanks to the release of main deckable Relic like Sabertooth Bright Leader and Garden of Omens, and thanks to efficient Relic like Boar Caleb's Choice, which was too specific to main deck it, but thanks to the release of Merchants and Smugglers around the same time, you could just play them in the market. All that together led to Sword not being able to top anything post 2019, outside of a few expedition tops in set 8 Compre Relics. Next up we have another set 1 card, Charge and Flail. It's a 1 power, double fire influence 1/1 relic weapon, and on summon you have to spend all your remaining power to give it the same amount of attack. Flail went through a very impactful nerf at the end of 2017, as seen in the data. It was a staple in Stonescar Midrange, FGS Armory and to a lesser extent Stonescar Acro before that nerf, because it was playable removal at any stage of the game that could also threaten to end games quick, and because it had great synergy with the widely played Smuggler's Dash, but the nerf to 2 power made it a lot less efficient, which led to it seeing 0 play until the nerf got reverted in early 2020. At that point even the reverted version wasn't really strong enough for Throne anymore, but it at least got some tops in Mono Fire and Stonescar Acro in 2020, and a single top in Almost World Championship FGS Armory list in 2021. More importantly, it was part of set 7 and 8 Expedition, in which it saw widespread play in decks with Dragonforge, like Stonescar Dragons, and in generic Acro decks like Rakano and Praxis Acro. On rank 6 we have the third set 1 card in a row, Sword of Aaria. It's a 3 power, 1 justice and 1 fire influence uncommon 3/2 relic weapon with Warcry. Similarly to the other sword on this list, Sword of Aaria had a very successful 2017 and to a lesser extent 2018 season. It fell out of favor in Throne in 2019 and had a last stint of success in 2020 Expedition. In Throne it was a staple, usually at 4 copies in Rakano Acro, FGS Armory and FGP Control in 2017 and 18, but Rakano Acro mostly dropped Sword of Aaria in 2019, and the other 2 decks got replaced by FGS Midrange and FGP Peaks Midrange in the same year, and both of those decks also weren't interested in Sword anymore, so it ended up without a consistent home in Throne from 2019 onward. It did have a last hooray in set 8 Expedition though, mostly in Rakano Acro and Rakano Armory. In the first it was just decent removal that could also hit face and occasionally buff a Tinker Overseer, while the second Rakano Armory played cards like Strange Blacksmith, Conspicuous Traveler and Armorsmith for additional synergy with relic weapons. On rank 5 we finally have a newer card again, Stonebreaker Bow. It's a 2 power, 1 fire and 1 shadow influence 2/1 common relic weapon with Overwhelm, and you can contract 2/1 activation to give it +2 attack this turn. Bow came out in set 12 Cold Hunt, shortly before the end of the 2021 season, but it still managed to get 12 expedition tops in just the last chance qualifier and worlds of that season, mostly in Stonescar Acro and Midrange, and 1 single Throne top in the aforementioned FGS Armory list that almost brought to worlds. Most of its points come from the 2022 season though. In Expedition it continued to see play in Stonescar Acro and Midrange in the last set 11 plus set 12 Expedition ICQ. Both those decks usually played 4 copies of Wobric's Choice. Back then Bow's attack buff on contract was permanent, so if you used it then traded the bow away, you could get it back later with Wobric's Choice and it would already have 4 attack, and then you could play it again, use that contract ability again to give it 6 attack. Some Stonescar midrange builds could go even further because they played some copies of only Forgesmith, which could give you double damage bows with several attack buffs. Most of Bow's tops came in the format after though, in set 12 plus 13 Expedition. more specifically from the widely played FPS aggro deck of that format. Relic weapon attacks can trigger Frenzy, which meant that you could consistently trigger Feln Adept, Stonebreaker Adept, or Nico the Urban Hunter with your Stonebreaker Bow, especially because it had Overwhelm, so you could even trade into a smaller unit and still get a Frenzy trigger. On the flip side, it was also a great way to answer the opponent's Feln Adept, because you could keep your bow after trading, because Feln Adept had 0 attack on your turn basically most of the time. In Throne, it was mostly played in FGS midrange, with additional synergy cards like Furious Magnaventris, and in Stone Scar Aggro, which also played Vobrek's Choice and Throne, partly because of the great synergy with Bow. The nerf to Bow, which meant that the contract ability wouldn't buff attack permanently anymore, came shortly before 2022 Worlds, so it didn't really have much of an impact on the competitive history of Bow, but it definitely made the card a lot weaker for the future. Next up we have another newer card, Lunar Claw. It's a 3 power, 1 Justice Influence legendary 1/4 relic weapon, and on summon you can either give it +3 attack this turn, or lock the opponent out of a spell in their hand for as long as you control Claw. Lunar Claw came out shortly after Bow in the mini set Valley Beyond, and was only legal for the World Championship in the 2021 season, in which it showed up in 2 Compre and 1 Archenport midrange list in Expedition. It was legal for all of 2022 Expedition though, and really proved its power there. In the last set 11+12 tourney at the start of 2022, it was played in a whopping 43 out of 113 decks, most importantly in Rakano Aggro, TGP Control and Horror midrange. The variation in deck types is a good indicator for how flexible the card was. Aggressive decks could use it to lock out sweepers like Harsh Wool, or to just deal 4 damage once to either kill the opponent faster, or to just get rid of an annoying blocker. But slower decks also liked it because it could be decent removal, or because it could slow down the opponent by locking them out of a crucial spell. Additionally, it had synergy with the widely played Furious Magnaventris, who was released in the same miniset, and it could be a brutal follow-up against opponents who planned on using Aura Condemnation on your attacking Magnaventris, because it made the attack more potent because you gained more armor, and because it could lock the opponent out of Condemnation for as long as you control the Lunar Claw. In set 12 and 13 Expedition, Claw continued to see play in Rakano Aggro, but it also found new homes in Archenport Minotaurs and later on Horror Control and FTJ Project. In its format, it was another great way to counter the omnipresent aforementioned Feln Adept, and the now nerfed Furious Magnaventris, who was nerfed from 5 to 4 health, so it was in perfect range for Lunar Claw. In Throne it had less success than in Expedition, but it still got some tops in, among others, Archenport Minotaurs and FGS and Archenport midrange. On rank 3 we have the third set 12 format card in a row, Stormhold Plating. It's an 8 power quadruple Justice Influence 6/8 legendary relic weapon that allows you to attack twice each turn. It also has Inscribe, and if you inscribe it, which means you play it as a depleted Justice Sigil, you get 2 armor. That flexibility made it playable in both formats, despite its high cost, because against faster decks you could always play it as a power and gain some life in the process, and it was a good way to just not get power screwed in any matchup. Like Stonebreaker Bow, it was released in set 12 and was only legal for 2 Expedition tournaments in 2021, but it was still able to rack up 19 points in decks like Archenport and Horror midrange. Additionally, it saw some Throne play in 2021, mostly in Compre ramp. And then it continued that success into 2022 in both formats. In Throne, it profited from the resurgence of Archenport Minotaurs, thanks to the release of Blackbox Pit Boss, and it profited from its synergy with Tough Rod Auric Banker. Additionally, it was a main deck staple in Archenport and Compre midrange, Compre ramp, and Horror Control. In Expedition, it continued to see play in Horror and Archenport midrange in the last set 11+12 tournament, and in set 12+13 Expedition and remained one of the best late game finishers for midrange and control decks thanks to its inscribed flexibility and to its sheer power once it hit the board. Its most important home in that format was Archenborn Minotaurs, but it also saw widespread play in Compre midrange, FTJ Project, and a wide array of other Justice midrange and control decks. From one Stormhold weapon to the next, Stormhold Knife. It's a 6-power double Justice influence rare 5/5 relic weapon that is free, which includes the influence cost, while you have 10 or less life. Stormhold Knife was part of the Homecoming campaign in early 2019 and immediately found multiple homes after its release, most importantly at 1 to 3 copies in the main deck of Horror Control and in the market of the deck that dominated the World Championship of the year, Rakano Valkyries. The fact that it was free when you took a lot of damage made it especially attractive for control decks as a tool to stabilize against more aggressive opponents, but midrange decks with a Justice market like Rakano Valkyries also made use of it. In 2020, it was played in FGS and Archenborn midrange, usually in the market, and in FTJ and Horror Control, usually in the main deck. It did lose a bit of momentum towards the middle of the 2020 season, mostly because it was rarely played in Horror Kira, the most successful deck with a Justice market from September 2020 to basically today, but it still got a total of 47 tops in 2021 and 2022 in decks like Horror and FGP Control, Compre Ramp, and Archenborn Midrange and Minotaurs. And on rank 1 we have the 4th Justice weapon in a row and another set 1 card, Auric Runehammer. It's a 4-power double Justice influence rare 4/1 relic weapon with a summon effect that makes you invulnerable to damage for the rest of the turn. Runehammer was never part of Expedition and dropped almost completely out of competitive round relevancy in 2020, but it was very successful in the first 3 Eternal seasons, which helped it gain an almost 100-point lead on Stormhold Knife. It even was one of just 5 cards that were part of the World Championship winning decks of 2017, 18 and 19, the other 4 being Torch, Vanquish, Privilege of Rank and Valkyrie Enforcer. While 4 power for just 4 damage is, and also was back then, quite expensive, the summon effect could easily make up for it, because it meant that you could 2-for-1 with it with the right setup. That made it a staple in a wide array of Justice aggro, midrange and control decks, and for aggro and non-armory midrange usually played it in the sideboard before Merchants got released. In 2017, it was played in the sideboards of Compre midrange, Rakano aggro and TGP midrange, and in the main deck of FGS Armory and Archenborn midrange, both of which played Tough Rod, Auric Broker, after he got released in the middle of the season, who could make Runehammer a lot more threatening, to the point where it could also trade with the opponent's Tough Rod without your Runehammer dying, because you were invulnerable for 1 turn, while also protecting your Runehammer from dying due to the endurance and strong stats. In 2018, Runehammer continued to see main deck play in Tough Rod decks, and additionally in FGP Control and towards the end of the season in Rakano Valkyries, FGS Midrange and TGP Control. At the start of the 2019 season it fell out of favor a little bit, only getting a few tops in different midrange decks here and there, but it picked up a lot of points at the end of the 2019 season in FGS midrange markets and in the main deck of Horror Control and Rakano Valkyries. It was able to take that momentum into the start of the 2020 season, where it was played in FGS midrange and Compre aggro main decks, but it stopped seeing play very abruptly after January 2020 and only got a single top in the 2022 Archenborn midrange list since then, even for a lot of Justice midrange decks, some even including strong synergy cards like Tough Rod, had success from 2020 to 2022. My best explanation is that the game just got a lot faster around early 2020 with the release of Set 8, Echoes of Eternity, Set 9, Archendevs and their respective mini-sets, which meant that 4 power to deal 4 damage got even worse because cheaper threats required cheaper removal, and it also meant that it got harder to protect the single armor point of Runehammer, which meant you couldn't 2-for-1 with Runehammer as often anymore. That made the card vastly inferior compared to other removal, which led to it fading out of competitive existence, but thanks to its big legacy, it could still comfortably secure the number 1 spot on this list. This marks the end of the 7th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and the previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.